to it. Thanks for being here again tonight. Appreciate it, especially realizing that going anywhere is starting to get a little bit more difficult as we think about things canceling. I appreciate you being here tonight. Today at Food Pantry, we instituted a new mandatory policy, which is kind of odd for Luther. We don't have mandatory anything. But I told all the Food Pantry clients that if they were going to eat, they needed to wash their hands. And they all very dutifully went off to the restroom and washed their hands before they ate. So in order to be fair about that, I declared that kind of a policy for all of us. We're just going to do that from now on. So tonight, I invited Alan Haynes to talk to us for a little while. And thank you for the attention you gave Connie last week. She was really interesting. It was nice to hear her in that role. Alan works for West Shore Consulting, and so does Tim DeMonte, and who would not want me to tell you that today's his birthday. So I will honor that request and not tell you that today is his birthday. And I would not suggest that you do anything to harass or mention that to him later on. Temper and stuff. I asked Alan to be here tonight because he also works with an issue that's very close to thoughts about climate change in our environment. Alan knows more about fracking than any human being I know. He is a professional geologist. He is one of those last remaining geology majors in the world. We've discussed that, how schools are getting rid of geology as a major. And I have a couple of copies of the collection of articles here. If you did not get one, I have two of these green books. It's a collection of articles. Denise needs one. I asked you to take a look at an article from the New York Times last week, and maybe you had a chance to do that. We'll take the two green ones here.
One to Sandy.
Take one to Sandy, too. One of those may not actually have this article in there. I had to pull one out because it doesn't matter why, I had to pull it out. I opened up last week by talking about the difference between a conversation and an argument, and summarized that with Martin Marty's line, the big difference between a conversation and an argument is nobody's trying to win a conversation. On the other side, there's also the difference between a conversation and a conversion. Especially in the world of faith, we get a bad reputation when people talk about trying to convert someone, although it can be a valid concept. But in a conversion, you're trying to replace someone's opinions with your opinions. And underneath that, you're trying to replace their experiences with your experiences. And underneath that, you're trying to replace your values for their values. And declaring invalid what their values and their experiences and their opinions have been. We've had experiences in history with forced conversions, and nobody has ever really truly converted from one thought to another, one idea to another, or one group or another by force. A conversation is where you discover what those opinions, and underneath that, what those experiences, and underneath that, what those values are. You may want to have an argument sometimes, and you may want to be leading toward conversion sometimes. Where things get really scary is when we don't know what it is we're doing. Are we having a conversation? Are we having an argument? Or are we trying to convert somebody? If we don't know which one we're doing, our experience has been we get sloppy, and we do it badly. So tonight I'd like you to keep in mind this second thought. The difference between an argument, the difference between a conversation and a conversion. Which one are you trying to have? If you had a chance to read the New York Times article, Tim's got a birthday call. He's got a it's probably Mom. Swimming Against the Tide. This was from the August 10th, 2014 New York Times. If you had a chance to read it, for those of you that did have a chance to read it, is there anything particular that jumped out at you and made you go, aha? If you haven't had a chance to read it, I understand. Life is that way.
I liked what he said about when he got into the water at the beginning of the summer, or August, or whatever he said he did. And it was the first time he really felt a part of, like a belong, when he was in that water.
To stand, this is the second line, to stand nearly naked, heavy from winter. Well, none of us have had that experience. On the water's edge, wade awkwardly into the shallows, dive under the first cold wave, taste first salt, surface, dive again to reach the calmer waters beyond, floating there until water and skin become the same temperature. This is the best way to know, the best way I know, to belong again, body and soul, to some larger part of the planet. Not just the city, not just the job.
Well, and the reason why that struck me, I mean, it's very poetic to begin with, but I know when Beats and I bought a house on a lake in Illinois, and I remember going down to the dock and putting my foot in the water, just dangling, and thinking that water was connected to everything else all the way around the shoreline. I was connected to all of that, just because I had my foot in that huge body of water. And that's what I thought of when I read that. Yeah, it does. It makes you feel one with everything.
And if you grew up Presbyterian or one of those flavors over there, just a little bit more to the Protestant side of Lutherans, you may have had to learn the Heidelberg Catechism. Lutherans learn Luther's small catechism, but the Heidelberg Catechism has that line in it. The very first question in the Heidelberg Catechism, what is your only comfort in life and in death? And the answer is that I am not my own, but belong, body and soul, in life and in death, to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. And then she moves on to say that rather than thinking of my Savior, Jesus Christ, she begins to think of, as AA kind of does, something bigger. Your higher power, or whatever you conceive that to be. She's broadening that up a little bit. I was not my own, but belonged to something bigger, but it also meant I was scared a lot. Thanks for that. If you had a chance to read it, is there anything else, part of it, that jumped out at you?
Moving closer to our present moment and our present environment, same lake, different shoreline after all of the storms of this winter and high water. And if anybody else has had the experience of seeing all of the debris, styrofoam on up to barn beams, on up to entire tree trunks, and anything in between, children's toys or grown-up boats that have been smashed around, or stairways, or any of that. The same feeling of being connected, but it's not as pleasant a feeling. But it comes from a similar heritage, in the sense of, all right, everybody else's trash is hit the shore, including some of our own.
First thing we would do in the spring on the Ohio River, where I grew up, was get in your boat and go downriver real slow to see if you could find where your dock went.
Oh, gosh. Well, and the other thing that I I really thought was interesting was just that juxtaposition between fear and hope. And hopelessness, it's too big for me to wrap my head around or do enough. I can't do enough to make a difference, a big difference, like to fix it. And I guess maybe that's where you get to the conversion part, where you want to convert everybody so that numbers of people can maybe actually get it done. But there's a fear in that. There's a fear in even stepping out and trying, and then there's, but you don't want to feel hopeless. You want to be able to do something, take action somewhere.
I know to be suspicious of apocalyptic thinking, if that's not a word that's in your vocabulary, apocalyptic thinking, when bad things come crushing down and they're totally outside of your control. A famous theologian once said, apocalyptic is the cry of the helpless. It's either the cry of the helpless because circumstances are falling down on them and there's nothing they can do about it, or the only thing they can find to put hope in is to burn everything down and start over again. Apocalyptic thinking. I know to be suspicious of apocalyptic thinking, my own and everyone else's. Numb denial of global warming will not do, but neither will helpless fear. I worry that among believers and deniers alike, blame is a way of avoiding a deeper problem, the problem of scale. Here's right. How do we bridge the distance between our own seemingly insignificant lives and actions and the scale of climate change so global and so slow? And the answer comes in the next paragraph when she's in the water down in the southern part of Lake Michigan in Indiana. You have to trust things outside yourself. What else jumped out at you? Anything? Anything that you read?
What I noticed is the focus on the interconnectedness. Of course, and in the environment, I was going to say in environmental science, but really in the environment, everything is connected. If one thing changes, something else changes, and but she's talking about feeling connected, and all of humanity is connected to each other, but we're also connected to our environment.
There comes a point where you realize the difference between a believer and an unbeliever, whether we're talking about faith or climate change, is actually pretty small. Because we're all swimming in the same sea or lake. This ought to help us empathize with global warming deniers. Brace yourself. This ought to help us empathize with global warming deniers, not just among the faithful. It's a long journey from finding science arrogant to being humbled by it. Feel the slow process of conversion there. It's a long journey from finding science arrogant to being humbled by it. And it's only harder to make when you're being blamed for the end of the world. Without knowing it, I was feeling out a new bridge between my life and the universe. Without hiding in fear. This is the very last page. Without hiding in fear or denial. You have to trust that your individual life is linked to something bigger, as Vitsa just said. That you belong, body and soul. There's that Heidelberg Catechism. That you belong, body and soul, to a larger story for which you are responsible. In this, those of us who believe the science might take a lesson from the faithful, and the rhetoric that would pit faith against reason ignores the millions, all of us perhaps, who live on both. Anything else that jumped out at you that you wanted to highlight before I turn this over to Alan and give him a little time to talk about what he does and what he thinks and who he is? want the stool? Do you want a microphone? What makes life better?
Can everybody hear me?
Bruce, can you hear him okay when he's talking?
Well, my name's Alan Haynes.
I want to ask Mike. Mike, does he need a microphone?
It's a little bit of a delay, so I'm not sure yet.
Okay.
Just if you try to project your voice, it should be just fine. I mean, if
Okay.
you're
I'm Alan Haynes. I'm a geologist. Way back, farther than I can almost think now. I got a bachelor's at Kent State and went to the University of Houston with the idea of looking for oil and got my master's there. And, I was originally wanted to be a high school history teacher and went all the way up to student teaching, couldn't get a job to save my life. And geology was kind of history, so I went back and did that. It was funny, the late 70s when I was in school was the mini ice age. We all thought that the world was going to be plunged into the new ice age because we had several years that were colder than average and it was going downhill. And the thought of climate change wasn't with us then, so I didn't feel too guilty about working for oil and gas, and I had a pretty fun 15 years or so in it, and the ups and downs, cyclical nature of looking for oil and gas got pretty old, and I've been laid off one too many times, so I went back and got a master's in hydrogeology and went into environmental. But still worked oil and gas up till 10 years ago or so. Fracking is an interesting subject. It's first I'd like you to know that petroleum geology, which there's several fields in geology: petroleum geology, hard rock, mining geology, and environmental hydrogeology. Those are kind of what you do as a geologist. Petroleum geology is pretty much dead. Fracking has killed it. So I'm no friend of fracking on that basis. Back in the day, you needed a geologist to help you figure out the little areas, the pockets where you could find oil. Nowadays with fracking, you can just about drill in a 3-county area and know what you're going to do. So it's an engineering play. And I just mentioned that I suppose as a earth scientist, most people would think I was pro-fracking. Obviously there's many reasons to be pro or anti, but just on a personal level, got a lot of friends my age out there who haven't been able to work in a few years, and it's because of fracking. So I hold that against it on a basic level. As long as we need metals, we're probably not going to get away from mining. And I've worked for environmental for quite some time, so maybe my karma's come back. We'll see. One thing I find is not many people really understand what it means to find oil and what fracking means and stuff. So just for a second, let me talk about that. Most of the oil that was produced in the United States and the world up to a little while ago, most of the world still, is what we call conventional traps. And traps are underground structures or stratigraphic changes in rocks that trap oil and gas. Oil, just like when you spill oil in a puddle, it wants to float to the surface. Underground is pretty much all saturated with water or some fluid. And oil wants to go uphill in that. And it goes uphill to a point where it can't go any farther. And those are called traps. And that's what a conventional trap is and what a petroleum geologist would look for back in the day. That oil comes from what are called source rocks. And source rocks are organic, rich rocks like shales, black shales underground, that once they're buried, they get heated up and in terms of petroleum geology get cooked and produce oil. We can do this in the laboratory, but it's still not fully understood. But that oil, once generated, gets squeezed out of that shale and gets into a permeable rock like a sandstone and goes uphill till it can't go any farther. Back in the day, and we still see this in places where we have oil seeps, some of it never got trapped and made it up to the surface. Fracking takes advantage of the fact that not all the oil and gas ever got out of that shale. It's trapped there, and these rocks are what are called tight, they're not permeable. They don't have pore spaces in them that allow it to flow, so they're trapped in there. So the idea, and this is the engineers invented, was you drill into them, and these tend to be long horizontal holes that go into them, and you pressurize them by pumping water and other chemicals down there that fracture the rock and allow some of that stuff to be released. Also with that water, you pump sand in that'll hold those fractures open. And that's how those are produced. And this has been the last 10 years, it's become everywhere. I should mention, Michigan's kind of the birthplace of fracking. Back in the 80s, we had a mini boom with natural gas called the Antrim Shale, which is it's a biogenetic gas. It's shale gas. It comes from the fact that when the glaciers were here, they forced a lot of fresh water down in these shales, and you had bacterial blooms that produced gas. And back in the 80s, this became quite a play. In fact, there's probably, I guess, about 30,000 Antrim wells. And it's what we would today call low volume fracking. That is, it doesn't take a lot of water compared to what they do today, but they would fracture this Antrim shale and produce gas. And of course, back when I started out, well, I've been everywhere: Louisiana, Texas, Wyoming, Colorado, Michigan, finally back to Texas. Geologists tend to move around. Back when I was here in the 80s, that was quite the play, and everybody was doing it. And part of the reason for that was natural gas was $7, $8 per MCF, and that was controlled by the state partly. That's falling apart. Right today, natural gas is under $2 per MCF, 1,000 cubic feet. And that's due to fracking. So, and as a geologist, I mean, it's a nightmare for all those people who are out there looking for it, because there's just, you can't compete with large corporations that are doing it. So, yeah, that was the 80s, and Michigan kind of invented fracking. Those were vertical holes. I should be honest, my wife's a geologist, my older son's a geologist, his fiance is a geologist, so we kind of talk about this stuff. The Antrim kind of died, probably in the last 5 or 10 years. You can testify to that, Tim.
I observed it for 5 years.
Yeah. Nowadays, it's an interesting, and I get off on a tangent here, stop and ask questions anytime you want. The problem we have today is that all these people who went out and drilled the Antrim put down a bond, but it wasn't much. And the problem we have today is that, and we didn't realize then, the natural gas and water that gets produced with that natural gas, and that's part of, I suppose, people are against fracking. The argument that you'll hear is we produce so much water with it, and it's contaminated, and that's true. But it also is radioactive, and the piping that has taken that water, circulated around to where it can be disposed of, is now radioactive, and that's sitting all over northern Michigan now, and people are wondering what to do with it. My son works for the oil and gas division of the Eagle, and he's dealing with that every day. He's got thousands of wells that are abandoned now because of those really gas pipes.
And Eagle is the new version of the Environmental Quality Department. Right? See that name?
The connection then with the bond is that those bonds scattered out and small were now insufficient in terms of funding to correctly cap these old wells, to contain them and keep them from further contaminating the environment. So now you've got, out of those 30,000 wells, X number that are on the loose, uncontained.
Yeah, it's not like just the other day I got called out to a site. They're digging up the place by the new Delta Motel down in Muskegon. They're going to put in a conference center, and they hit a a well that was drilled in the 1860s or 70s, and they actually were looking for brine. They were going to use it for hot tubs in Muskegon, which I never realized we had brine hot tubs in Muskegon, but we did. And they hit oil, so they went, oh my God. You know, they capped it and walked away from it. They just dug it up. But there's, Muskegon's the site of, and this is way before fracking, in the late 1920s, we had one of the first major oil fields in the United States, the Muskegon oil field, Dundee, which is a formation. And there are probably 1,500 wells down there or something. A lot of those are not properly plugged. This predates any of the regulations that told you how you did it. A lot of times people would drop an iron bowling ball basically down there and call it quits, or throw a few tree stumps down. So some of those are leaking, obviously. But on to fracking. And I find people who, fracking gets, I think in a lot of people's minds, just, it gets used for the oil industry as a whole. But fracking, since we're talking about that, I'll get specific. Is back in the early 2000s that it really became a thing in places like the Permian Basin, the Williston Basin, North Dakota, where engineers figured out that if we pressurized these wells, we could produce from shale. And also an advantage of that was that we, back when I sat oil rigs back in the early 80s out in the Gulf of Mexico, in soft sediments we could go a mile sideways. Nowadays you can go a mile or more sideways in hard rock, hard shales and stuff. And that's the technology we needed. You also what's called geosteering. You can sense. They've got actually navigational controls like they have in aircraft that sense momentum. They can tell where you are in a rock. So they know the productive zone. They can stay right in there and go a mile out. With that kind of technology, fracking became possible. And places like the Williston Basin, if you look at a night shot of it, it's totally lit up. I mean, that's all the drill rigs that are out there. And the way they do it is they, like I said, it's not a petroleum geology play, it's an engineering play. They just drill on spaces that are regulated, and you know, every quarter mile, you know, you have another borehole. And some of that's done on the idea that it's just like water rights. Companies get into big fights, are you drawing off my well? So that has a lot to do with spacing of those. So of course there's been a boom in the United States, and now we're the #1 oil producer in the world. And interestingly enough, it's what's called a sweet crude, which is a light crude, which is really the preferable crude. But our refineries, the people that take oil and make it into other things, can't handle it because we're set up for the heavy, kind of more tar-like oil that comes out of Canada and the old U.S. If you want to get upset about something, probably the tar sands up in Canada are much worse than anything we're doing. I think fracking is, on paper, it's like the BP Horizon. You know, if they'd done what they were supposed to, it wouldn't have been an issue, but they didn't. They didn't let the cement set. Fracking on paper isn't that bad. Many times it's done right, but what happens is that humans make mistakes. One thing that drives me crazy that people talk about is this idea, and I'll see it on paper sometimes, that you'll drill a borehole, you know, several thousand feet down and go horizontal, pressurize it, and those cracks will work their way up to the surface and release this, you know, chemical-laden water they use for fracking into the water table. That's impossible. You could blow a nuclear bomb up at 7,000 feet, it wouldn't fracture to the surface. There's just too much pressure. what happens is when they drill down, and I'll talk about Michigan, you have the glacial drift sediments, which are the sands and uncompacted shales and clays and stuff. You drill down through that, and you got to drill at least 100 feet into the bedrock, and you cement it off, so you've got a seal. And then you drill through that cement plug, and you can drill down. And what that's meant to do is seal off the glacial drift, which most of us use for drinking water, for drinking groundwater, from the bedrock. Where we have problems is where that's not done properly, and you pressurize these things up. I talk about the old Antrim. They didn't pressure those to a tenth of what they do today. You've got tens of thousands of pounds of pressure, and if that surface casing can fail, if there's any deficiency in it, then you'll be pumping these chemicals out into the aquifers. If you talk to people in the oil and gas industry, that never happens, but of course it does. In the Antrim days, a lot of the work Tim and I did was looking for bedrock scours up in northern Michigan, and those are, when the glaciers melted, they cut deep, 500-foot deep ravines into the bedrock. And they're all over the place, and then the Antrim drillers, if they drilled into one of those or next to one of those, they recognized that they could lose that frac fluid out into the formation. We tried to keep them away from that, so we did some good work there. But obviously, fracking is everywhere now. You hear the argument from the oil and gas industry and other people, obviously, that methane is a good step over to cleaner fuels, and of course it is. But the problem is, Cleveland Browns? I'm from Cleveland.
I went to Kent State for a year.
The problem is that there's a lot of methane being released in this. If we did it perfectly, methane wouldn't be released, but the facilities leak. Sometimes they leak a lot. Our regulations on that have been weakened over the last few years. No surprise. We actually have a camera. We can go around and see methane leaks, and that has been, the regulations covering that have been dummied down. We don't do that much anymore. So that's become easier. So one of the major problems with any oil and gas production, that's kind of why talking about fracking is a separate thing. Any oil and gas operation, a lot of times you get methane, and they're not sealed very well. A lot of times, some companies do a lot better job than others, and if they are not sealed well, the methane gets into the atmosphere, and then obviously is much worse than CO2.
And they blame it on the cows, right?
And the cows hold some credit. So, anyways, so that's where we are. I don't know.
I remember that a given vertical shaft, the one that goes down a few thousand, can have several legs running off it with directional drilling. So when you see individual wells and you think, oh, there's not that many of them, well, there's this, like the roots of a tree. Or,
not so much in Michigan. In Michigan, Michigan, there's been, last time I counted, probably 10 or 12 attempts at really high volume fracking. And there's a couple formations here that people were interested in. The Uinta, which is deep and old. And that's the one down in southeast Ohio, which is getting all the attention. They're producing down there. And also I think it's the A2 carb, which is Silurian, which is up higher. Fracking has been that high volume fracking has been unsuccessful in Michigan. High volume fracking is not coming to the state anytime soon. Nobody can make any money at it. So we just don't have the rock formations that are good for
But
it.
it does exist in the Dakotas and
Absolutely.
Montana and Texas.
So sometimes totally my backyard stuff here. It doesn't work here. And nature's I don't see that happening. There's not going to be a fracking being here. Yes, eastern New Mexico, western Texas, the Williston Basin, the Marcellus Plate in Pennsylvania, very eastern Ohio, the Uinta Plate in eastern, southeastern Ohio. My parents have a 60-acre part of my dad's farm down in near Carrollton, Ohio, and it's just amazing to go down there. Just giant. Usually in Appalachian Basin, that's part of Michigan Basin, you see these little oil rigs that is all you need to drill here, because generally you don't go deeper than 4,000 feet. And you see rigs like you see down in the Gulf of Mexico offshore, these things that go up storage, and they're built to drill thousands of feet down and thousands of feet laterally. They're just gigantic. But of course, Carrollton is unrecognizable today. It's just, it's been a boon to the economy. So you have that argument, for the people that live there would be very upset at us if we were trying to knock fracking. So and Ohio.
Yeah.
There's a lot of poor people in Ohio.
One or two.
Yeah. So there's a lot of people are very thrilled that the oil industry has come their way in that neck of the woods.
And this has a lot to do, in fact, with why Ohio went from being a mixed red-blue state to pretty solidly red right now, because the population wants to support. We got some time for some questions or thoughts?
Sure.
Or Bruce is already getting us into that. I just wanted to say before we got into that how incredibly impressed I am with the fact that you can talk about those kind of things, which are really complicated, and just do it in really easy to
Well, you talk
handle
about
language.
theology all the time.
Well, I wish those of us who talk theology could do it in ordinary language, just like you just did. I'm just really impressed by that, Alan, and also to recognize that we did have a natural gas boom. You started seeing buses in cities that were natural gas, and it did turn the United States into an energy exporter, which was a goal several decades ago, when we were buying our energy from countries we weren't too sure about. So all of those things play into this, but the way that you can explain it in such simple terms, I'm just really impressed by that.
I have, I guess, a comment and a question. The question's unrelated. So, I'm not from Michigan, I'm from New York State, and for a number of years, there was a fracking controversy. Should they, shouldn't they? A lot of the southern tier of New York State is in the Marcellus Shale region or basin adjacent to Pennsylvania. And people could see the economic boom going on in Pennsylvania. So there was a lot of controversy. Should we, shouldn't we? The economics versus the environmental concerns. And I think the whole state is now under a fracking moratorium.
Have been for
And-
4 years now.
Yeah, but prior to that, it was there were certain areas of the state that there was definitely a moratorium. And it was mainly because the water supplies feed major population areas, and then it went from that to now we're not going to frack, which I think is good because New York is a water-rich state as well. Unfortunately, as a shale basin state as well.
Yeah, and I didn't bring that up, but that's certainly one of the issues around it is the water that gets used. And I think in Michigan you tend to forget that we have so much water that it's not a concern. But certainly out west it becomes quite an issue. And then most people once the goal is you pump it down there and you pump it back out and you get 60-70% of it back. What do you do with that water? And most people put it in an injection well, which in my mind there's no better way in the world to get rid of something you don't want than pump it several thousand feet underground. But obviously there's places where they pumped it in faults and had earthquakes and stuff, so you've got some problems there too.
Is that what happened in eastern Ohio, southeastern Ohio? Because all of a sudden, Warren, Ohio was like shaking every couple of weeks.
Right.
Is that what it was?
Yeah, this has been, people have noted earthquakes with injection wells for a long time. It's just now that we have so many, and only 1 out of probably 50 of them give any problem, and those are the ones that happen to be near a fault or intercept a fault. Any fault underground, depending on where you are, some are more than others, but they have a stress on them. They're trying, they want to move. And believe it or not, plate tectonics lives. We move about as fast as your fingernails grow, all the time. And that force is building up all the time. And if you loosen them up, they're going to pop.
So actually, the question that I had, you had said something about light crude oil, but all our refineries are set up for heavy. So where does it go?
A lot of it has been exported now, and we've had problems keeping up with it. We are building sweet crude kind of refineries, but we're a little bit behind. But so that's some of what's being exported to places that are more sweet, have more sweet oil.
Going back to your idea of the injection wells, putting things deep underground in a relatively water-rich state like Michigan, that might not seem like we're subtracting much from the hydrological cycle that produces rainfall and so on up in the upper layers. But in South Dakota or Montana or Wyoming, water is considerably more scarce. And you're putting out of circulation, out of the local hydrological cycle, down into those injection wells, and therefore changing the climate, the potential for any rainfall up there at the surface of the earth.
They certainly are subtracting a lot of water in places that it's needed. That's true.
Any other thoughts that you want to?
Alan, what do the chemicals do they're pumping down there, and why? Because it seems to be part of the problem.
Yeah, they're meant to, things like glycol and alcohols and things are meant to kind of lubricate to be able to get the sand in there, and they help that process. A lot of it's not crazy bad. Some of it is.
So when you say glycol and alcohol, I don't think of that as being
Yeah,
crazy bad.
a lot of it is that kind of stuff.
It's hand sanitizer.
Pretty much. Sweet hands.
Yeah.
So how does it get?
What's the bad
ingredient-
chemicals?
Sorry,
All right, what's the bad chemicals and why are they?
No, I really don't know everything I should about that.
Do you know why there's so much secrecy about not telling people what they're
It's
pumping down there?
the competition between Schlumberger and Dresser Atlas. I mean, they don't, it's just like a cake recipe. You don't want somebody to know
It's
what
like Coke versus
why your
Pepsi.
cake's
By federal law, they're exempt from having to reveal it. The formula remains a proprietary trade secret, and they don't have to divulge.
I think that's
under
okay when you're in a
federal or
closed
state
environment,
law.
but when you're pumping it into public,
And so they basically look at all of you and say, trust us. I say that being the father of a son who worked for Schlumberger for 6 years, but he was in HR, not drilling. But was still, at the point he joined the firm, they had 120,000 employees globally, and they were ramping up to 150. So they needed to add 30,000 employees in a short period of time. They needed a serious expansion of their HR. Then when the cycle went back the other way, they also needed a reliable HR to release tens of thousands of employees in a 6 to 12 month span. That's the scale of, and they are in the drilling business. They are bigger than the next two competitors combined. Dresser and Baker Hughes, even if you added them together, it would
It has
have
been the most profitable, industry in the world.
You did mention earlier on, though, at the beginning of your talk, that the oil world in general is boom and bust.
Oh,
I mean, not just the oil companies, but Venezuela is boom and bust.
Yeah.
Should
No,
we-
it's a story that's not told when you're a geology student. It's, it's my first office job I got hired on, and the guy who got hired on with me got laid off 2 months later. Because things were going down. And that's just been a crazy ride ever since. I've only worked part-time for the oil industry for the last 15 years or so, but before that, when I depended on it, it was, the only good thing I can say about it is after my daughter was born, I got to spend 6 months of quality time with her after I got laid off.
Should we expect that the world of natural gas and the world of something like fracking, the industries that are doing that are going to continue kind of on that same cycle? Is this a boom and bust kind of thing too? We're doing it now, but we won't be doing it in.
Yeah, the general feeling about fracking is it would kind of stabilize things because you have this ongoing production, and it's people could turn back the taps if the supply got too high. And the goal of oil and gas people is to hold oil at $60 a barrel or so, where you don't start pricing people out. You keep gas at $3 a gallon, and you keep natural gas at $3 per MCF, so it's still relatively cheap, but you don't let it fall below that. But then you get, the trouble is, all our oil and gas prices, we don't set them in the U.S., they're set by the world market. So we have to live by that. And you've got Saudi Arabia ticked off at Russia, so they say we're just going to open the taps. And even though it hasn't happened yet, everybody in anticipation, it's crashed then. So if this keeps up for long, we're going to stop drilling here, they're going to shut back, and kind of like, this is what has happened all through my experience, is that you can't just turn an oil well off. It's a big decision. Because to bring it back online, you just don't turn it back on. You got to recondition it, do all kinds of things. But it's quite an investment. So you don't turn it off any sooner than you have, so you're already going bankrupt by the time you do. And so the small guys are wiped out. And then the oil production drops, and all of a sudden oil prices go back up, and everybody runs around offside it and reconditions them and gets going. And there's some lag there because people don't really trust it's come back for a while. So a few months later, it's going back up until you've overproduced, and then you start the cycle all over again. With fracking, the thought was that it would kind of simmer things down because you had such a potential oversupply that you could really and you don't necessarily have to turn it off, you can just turn it back. That you could moderate things more. But that doesn't take into account the kind of mega forces out there like Saudi Arabia who do something like they just did to us.
So to contextualize that, the latest play by the Saudis has driven the price down to round numbers 30 a barrel. Remember, 50 is a minimal, 50 to 60 to be profitable. And so suddenly Wyoming and South Dakota and even West Texas are going, ain't no new holes to drill because they can't make money at it. Good operators, like my son was in charge of helping hire and fire. The really highly skilled operators make round numbers about $250,000 a year. That's the guy in charge and a rig with those horizontal directional drilling below that several thousand feet central shaft. The guy in charge of that is making round numbers of $250,000 a year. So
Back in the day, back in the 80s when I was offshore drilling, directional drillers, and it was much more of an art back then, before all the technology, were making $600 an hour. And they could work quite a bit. And I calculate that out of mine, that's not bad money.
I'm curious, can you help me understand how fracking is causing radioactivity in water? And
The radioactivity is already in the
It's there.
water.
It's
You've got-
naturally there.
You've got a water, clay is radioactive to some degree. It's got things like uranium and different radioactive minerals in it. So the water is sitting there forever, and the natural gas in it picks up that radioactivity. And when they extract it, it makes the pipes that carry the radioactives.
so is there anything we know of? I mean, you're talking about chemicals that they actually use, that they put in there.
That's not what makes it radioactive.
No, I understand it came
Okay.
from the uranium and all that, but we've got two contaminants that we're talking about. We've got the radioactivity, and then we've got whatever chemicals they use to do the fracking.
Right.
So is there any process to, I don't know, get some of the chemicals out, or you can't do much with
Well,
radioactivity, can
in a
you?
perfect world,
There's no filter for radioactivity, I mean.
right, and that's true. And Michigan is going to spend a fortune over the next few decades removing a lot of those pipes. Some of them are just best left underground. If they're out in the middle of nowhere and they're buried sufficiently deep, the radioactivity gets attenuated, as it's covered up. It's some of the shallower pipes, and especially in places that are traveled, where it's more of a problem. And as in anything, some farmers, and I hear about, my son's working on this, I hear about this, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. Some farmers are just, have these oil or gas wells, are just, worried to death about this and want it all out of there. And some just say, I'm still walking, aren't worried about it. But we're going to spend a lot of money digging those things up. And those are called orphan wells, and Eagle is sorely underfunded for that stuff and ends up only doing, a handful a year, and there's literally thousands of them out there.
Is there a map or something that can show us where they are?
So.
So that we can find out how close our,
Well,
the
yes.
water, we've got well water, I'm thinking, how close is this to?
There are none of these answer wells here.
Did you hear what he just said?
No.
But that's
this
it
is
again?
not Joe's.
None of these antrim wells I'm talking about are near you. They're all up in northern Michigan. I had a map here.
There are orphan wells in Muskegon.
Yes, but they're not the radioactive ones. You worry about oil, leaking oil.
What are some regulations that should be put in place in a perfect world?
In a perfect world, you pay more, they put up a bigger bond and drill a well. And in a perfect world, the Michigan government wouldn't spend it on other stuff. They'd set it aside and save it for that.
The orphan wells, in other words, become taxpayer money.
Yes.
Private parties made their profit,
Yeah.
they're gone, and they threw their iron ball down the hole. They're out of here, long since bankrupt, and now it's public dollars that have to solve the problem so that Melanie's well is good. This is what pizza says.
I like the glowing personality.
I hear it causes coughing.
This is
Enough?
a picture of oil and gas wells in Michigan. The red ones are gas wells, the green are oil, and that's predominant. A lot of oil wells produce each. The black ones are dry holes. There's about 60,000, and I think we're up to 65,000 in Michigan. This is the Antrim trend. Here, that's what we're saying. These wells a little bit down here. This is the northern reef trend. It's a different thing. If you live in this area, Gaylord, there.
We've got a little red there, and
Oh yeah, no, Muskegon's got a lot of oil. And a lot of them go back to the 50s or even earlier. So There's some pretty old wells. I just, a couple of years ago, people were excited about exploring this Muskegon County. We went out and did a little geophysics for that, but nothing ever came of it. They drilled a hole out by Dalton Township that was dry, and everybody, the oil and gas industry is everybody follows everybody, and if the lead goes up in a different direction, so Muskegon County was hot there for a little bit.
Alan, what's the relationship between fracking and formational sinkholes?
There's no strong correlation there. I can imagine circumstances where you had and not just fracking, but in any production case, even water wells, where you have a leaking casing and you can wash out some of the formation. But fracking, where you actually pressurize the well is so deep underground, the hydrostatic pressure wants to crush those fractures back. So there's no localized subsidence. Now, you've got in places like Houston, where you got sediments laid down in the water, like an ocean. They're always, those sediments to some degree are always held apart by that water pressure or oil pressure. And the second you start pumping that out, you lose that. Houston, the city of Houston has subsided 7 or 10 feet over the last 70 years or so due to oil and gas production. A lot of the coastal subsidence you see in Louisiana is due to oil and gas production like that. But that's not the localized. And you get a lot of sinkholes in northeast Michigan, and that's from fracturing. You get karsting and the limestone up the cave formation underground. And those, just like what happens in Florida when the carbonates get washed out, carbonates, CaCO3 is soluble in water, so you get enough water going through it, you get Mammoth Cave, where you get a hole underground, and if it's shallow to the surface, you don't have a nice surface under it or over it, and overburden it can collapse in. So we've got a lot of sinkholes up in northern Michigan, but they're natural.
That bell actually means that it's 8 o'clock, and I promised everybody that we would give everybody a chance to escape at 8 o'clock. Of all the, I want to do two things though at the very end here. One is, of all the things that you named, and you've mentioned methane, you've mentioned fracking, you've mentioned oil wells, of all of those things that you've mentioned tonight, is there anyone on that list that we should actually worry about? What should we validly be worried about? Anything on that list?
I think when it comes to oil and gas, what worries me the most is the methane that's escaping. If you all recall, probably a couple of years ago, somebody took one of these oil gas finder cameras out to California and was able to document just how much methane was coming out of an old production facility there. A lot of the oil and gas fields are leaking methane into the atmosphere, and since it is such a greenhouse gas, that's a concern. Probably the biggest one.
So if I were going off to college this fall to be an environmental science type person, yes, Hanukkah is going to be used as an object lesson twice. What would you want to say to somebody that was interested in going off and doing that? 18, going off to college first time, wants to do something environmental.
Hopefully we'll have a friendlier environment for them to graduate into. Hopefully they can get a job. But it'd be kind of neat to go into the atmospheric sciences, like Clint Eaton's third kid, and do that kind of work. We're not going to. I get pretty depressed when I think about reversing climate change. I suggest you all go. We've got a geologist named Richard Alley who I get a Christmas card from him every year.
The ice core guy?
Huh?
The ice core guy
Yeah.
from Greenland?
Yeah, he's a geologist. He teaches in Pennsylvania at, what's the name of the Slippery Rock? Whatever.
That's right, he's a Slippery Rock.
Anyways, he does a great job talking about proving that a lot of the CO2 increase is man-made, and does a nice job of it. And he's a conservative politically. He's been kind of banned from the Republican Party now, but he's a good scientist. I put that on your list to watch. It's really interesting. I don't know how I got off on that.
Say the name again?
Richard Alley, just like an alley behind your house.
Alley. His big thing is the ice cores in Greenland. Maybe you've heard of this.
Mhm.
You drill down and take several hundred feet of core ice, and then you can analyze the trapped air bubbles in that ice from however old, and from that determine the degree of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere of the Earth at a given stage in
You
geologic
can look
history.
at the atmosphere at those points in time. They can go back a couple 100,000 years. And of course, in the oil and gas industry, a lot of geologists are very skeptical about climate change being related to human activity. And there's good reason for that. I was hard to convince at first too. And that's because you go back in time and the climate's all over the place. There's been tropical fish down off Antarctica, if you're willing to go back far enough. The thing that separates this probably is how quickly it's changed. Usually it doesn't flip as quick. And that's scary. Plus CO2 is just off the charts, and that's recognized as that, greenhouse effect.
The conversation that you just were talking about Dr. Alley and the ice leads me to suggest some things for next week. I do have a guest that I've asked to come for next week. That person has not said yes yet, so I'm not going to spill the name. But the next set of articles in here, these really short ones from Living Lutheran, one is about Alaska and Shishmaref. The second one in here is climate change and migration, climate change and ice core, climate change and world hunger. I'd like to have you take a look at those, if you will, and we're going to kind of discuss some of those things. I've just discovered that the book that I have here is missing. No, there it is. Yeah, here we go. The very first one of these articles talks about ice and ice core in Antarctica and all of that. So we can get into those.
Oh, okay.
Talk about those next 4 little articles, or those will be kind of the topics that we'll rally around. I hope that tonight you've discovered that Alan is somebody you can have a conversation with, and knows a lot of stuff, and is pretty easy to talk to, seems pretty non-threatening, and has experienced a conversion of sorts in the process. So please stick around and talk all you want tonight. If you are helping us clean the kitchen, I need to make a plug that our health inspector comes tomorrow morning. So if you can do a really extra good job in the kitchen tonight, it would make my life a lot easier. But I really want to thank Alan for being here tonight and talking so easily and so well about what he does. So thank you very much, Alan. Thank you so much.
Good job. Anybody going by the cemetery? To your right. I'm cold. Cemetery?
Didn't even tell you what the real title was. Prison.
Yeah, I'm cold.
Oh,
I live right across from the cemetery.
I go geologist and geophysicist.
Right?